Hello everyone, I'm Josh Redstone. Welcome to my YouTube channel where I am presently attempting to bring some of the philosophy courses that I've been teaching this semester at Carleton University into an online format. Of course, my students will be aware that the reason I'm doing this is because of the COVID-19 situation. Carleton University and many other universities throughout the country have begun moving their courses to online formats for the remainder of the term due to the COVID-19 situation. So thanks for joining me, firstly, to all my students and anyone else who might be watching. This is the first of my online lectures for Philosophy 1301B, Mind, World, and Knowledge. I want to say before we get into it today that I hope you're all doing well, whether you're a student of mine or just somebody who's happened to stumble upon this video because you're, say, stuck at home with nothing else to do. I hope you're doing well. I know this has been a tough week or so, so my best wishes go out to all of you. And secondly, I wanted to say to my students, I know, as I've just said, I know it's been a tough week. It's certainly been more difficult than I would have liked to bring my course into an online format, to turn it into an online class. I'm not really set up to do this. However, I will do my best to make sure that the learning outcomes for this course are achieved, and that you all have an opportunity, or we all have an opportunity, to cover the remainder of the course material together. So, with that said, let's get started. All right, so the topic of today's lecture is knowledge sources. In fact, that is the title of this chapter, Chapter 5 in our course text, Knowledge Sources. And this chapter, as well as the chapter that follows it, which we'll be covering soon, deals with epistemology. Now, epistemology is the study of knowledge. It addresses questions like, what is knowledge, and how do we know when we have it? Now, of course, we haven't had a chance to talk about this very much so far throughout this course. We've spent most of our time talking about metaphysics, and to a lesser extent, ontology. So if you recall, metaphysics is nicely captured with the two questions, what exists and what is it like? Metaphysics is therefore the study of reality. Ontology is the study of being, and some philosophers see ontology as a subfield of metaphysics. Some see it as its own independent, although interrelated field. I don't really have any strong opinions either way on that. But in any case, I'm excited to finally turn towards epistemology. As we do that, I'd like you to keep in mind something that our textbook author calls the egocentric predicament. So what is the egocentric predicament? Well, the egocentric predicament is the predicament that we're all stuck in as egocentric individual humans. It's meant to capture this idea that we can't really get out of that perspective unless we develop special tools. They could be philosophical tools like a theory of knowledge, or they might be scientific tools, which I'll discuss in a moment. But if you think about it, we're all kind of stuck inside of our own point of view. And that's not just to say that I have a different point of view on this or that from the next person, although that is a part of it. But it also captures the way in which we're sort of limited in the ways that we perceive the world. So for example, human beings can only hear certain frequencies of sound. They can only perceive certain wavelengths of visual light. So when we're confronted with metaphysical questions like, does the external world exist? Is that what's really real? Or is what's really real the mental rather than the external world? When we're confronted with questions like that, we're trying to answer them from, our own egocentric perspective, and we're kind of stuck there unless we develop other tools to answer those questions. And of course, we can develop scientific tools that will extend the range of human perception. Those are helpful, but we also need philosophical tools, and that's what epistemology is for. epistemology helps us establish when we're justified in saying that we know something. So when we have knowledge versus opinion or belief or perception. Epistemology is meant to give us that firm foundation for our knowledge. So, with that said, keep the egocentric predicament in mind. It will likely be a recurring theme as we continue to discuss epistemology. But as far as that discussion goes, let's begin, as our textbook does, with the work of Rene Descartes. All right, so Rene Descartes was a philosopher and mathematician who lived and worked during the first half of the 17th century. And he's well known in philosophical circles for his methodological doubt, or his systematic skepticism. Basically, Descartes wanted to work out what he could be certain of. And how did he do that? Well, he applied this methodological doubt to all of his beliefs, doubting everything that he thought he knew, until he established some kind of secure foundation upon which he could build his system of knowledge back up again. He takes this approach in the Discourses on the Method, as well as in Meditations on First Philosophy, and this is the work that is quoted in the course text. So, Descartes began by noting how a lot of his knowledge actually rested upon an appeal to authority. In other words, much of the things he thought he knew for certain were in fact things he merely believed on appeal to authority. Religious authority, scientific authority, that kind of thing. And Descartes realized that he had no support for these beliefs besides this appeal to authority. And so he reasoned that he could justifiably doubt those beliefs. So he questioned all of his beliefs, beginning with all of those that he held for the simple reason that they came from some kind of authority. But what about knowledge from the senses? We get a lot of knowledge from the senses, or at least we think we do, and this is where Descartes uses his famous beeswax exercise. While Descartes is doing all of this meditating in the Meditations, he has the reader, picture him by the fire, reflecting, thinking. Whether this was actually how the Meditations were really written, I'm not sure. But in any case, Descartes is sitting there by the fire, thinking about what he could be certain about, and he ponders, this little chunk of beeswax that he has. When he holds it in his hand, it's solid. It has a certain floral fragrance to it. If he knocks it on the table, it makes a sound. So the beeswax has certain properties when it's in a solid state. But if he places it near the fire, he knows, it melts, it loses its aroma, it becomes clear, it turns into a liquid, and it becomes hot. If he were to rely solely on his senses, he would be forced to conclude that the beeswax was actually a different substance when it was melted versus when it was solid. But of course he knows it's still beeswax. But he doesn't know this because of what his senses are telling him. He doesn't know that molten beeswax and solid beeswax are the same substance because of how he perceives things. He knows it's the same substance because he's relying on his understanding, not his senses. So Descartes figures, I can probably doubt what my senses are telling me. But he goes a little bit further than that. I mean, what about his ordinary perception of the world? Even if he were not confronted with melting gobs of beeswax or something, could he trust his perceptions of the world, his everyday perceptions? And he says no. The reason why is, consider dreaming versus reality. When we're dreaming, we're hardly aware that we're actually dreaming. And even when we're awake, it's not like we go around saying to ourselves, oh, I'm certainly awake right now. Look at how awake and aware I am. That's just not how we do it. So when we're dreaming, we often don't know that we're dreaming unless we're having, say, a lucid dream, for example, where we realize we're dreaming as we're still dreaming. So when Descartes realized this, he further realized that, he could be having a dream of sitting by the fire, pondering epistemology, watching beeswax go from a solid to a liquid state, and he would have no way of knowing whether he was dreaming or awake. So he concludes that, well, yes, I should doubt the knowledge from my senses, because my senses can deceive me. Things can change their form, yet still remain the same substance. We can be dreaming and not realize we're dreaming. Of course, we can have hallucinations, that kind of thing. So our senses can mislead us, and we don't often have reliable ways of knowing when that's happening. So Descartes thinks, I better doubt what my senses are telling me. But what about the certainty of something like mathematics? Well, okay, beeswax can go from a solid to a liquid state. I can dream and think that I'm awake, all right, but certainly 2 plus 2 must always equal 4, or certainly the angles of a triangle must always add up to 180 degrees, right? Those are mathematical certainties. We should be able to be certain of them. Well, again, Descartes finds a way to doubt even mathematical certainty. He wrote that, for all he knew, an evil genius, some kind of evil, omnipotent, malevolent being, could deceive him into thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 5, or that the internal angles of a triangle add up to a greater or lesser number than 180 degrees. And because he's being deceived, he would have no way of knowing that he is being deceived about these mathematical certainties. So what he thinks, or what he formerly thought was as certain as you could get, the truths of mathematics, can also be doubted. So where does he go from there? Well, this is how Descartes gets to his foundation of certainty, if you like. He reasoned that even if such an evil genius, right, this malevolent being who's deceiving him about the nature of reality, existed and was tricking him about everything, he could still be certain about one thing. As long as he continues to doubt, even if he's being deceived, he can be certain that he exists. And he wrote, I must finally conclude and maintain that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I pronounce it or conceive of it in my mind. So, even if he's being misled by his senses, or an appeal to authority, or whether some malevolent, omnipotent being is tricking him about the nature of reality, he can be sure about one thing. He exists, because there is someone who exists who is being deceived. This is summed up in Latin by his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This dictum has become known as the cogito, and it is Descartes' foundation for knowledge. This I am, I exist. So, Descartes found a foundation for his knowledge, the cogito, but it's very limited. He can be reasonably certain, well, even if I'm being deceived about everything, certainly I exist. But this is a very limited kind of certainty. And it introduces a couple of problems. One of the problems that I want to talk about is called solipsism. So solipsism is the view that one's own mind and the contents of that mind are the only things that you can be certain about. They're the only things that you can know for sure exist. And Descartes, in a kind of solipsistic box here with his, he's brought himself into a kind of solipsistic box with his cogito. I am, I exist. I think, therefore I am. Okay, great. But that's the only thing that he can be certain about now. So he has to build his knowledge back up if he's to avoid this trap of solipsism. In other words, only knowing for certain that his own mind and its contents exist. So how did Rene Descartes avoid this solipsistic viewpoint that he had kind of reasoned himself into? Well, essentially, Descartes argues for the existence of a benevolent God. So, a God unlike this so-called evil genius, a God who would not deceive him about the nature of reality. And he gives a few different arguments for the existence of this kind of God. For example, he offers an ontological argument that's very much like St. Anselm's ontological argument, and that is, if God is a perfect being, he must necessarily exist. God being perfect God would not be perfect if God lacked existence, therefore God must necessarily exist. It's very similar to St. Anselm's ontological argument, which we covered in previous lectures. So that's one of the arguments that Descartes offers. Another argument is all about what he calls clear and distinct ideas. Descartes argues in the Meditations that his clear and distinct ideas are the only ideas upon which any thinking person should rely. And Descartes claims to have a clear and distinct idea of God. So he reasons that because his ideas are clear and distinct, and he's got a clear and distinct idea of God, well, God must really exist. The long and short of this is that clear and distinct ideas that exist in one's understanding are reliable. He argues further that, as an imperfect finite being, Descartes could not have conceived of such a clear and distinct idea, that is, an idea of this benevolent, all-knowing, non-deceiving God, by himself. In short, a finite being, Descartes argues, could not conceive of an infinite being like God on its own. So that's why Descartes argues that this clear and distinct idea of God must have come from God himself, because as a finite being, Descartes could not conceive of a being like God without God himself. So, he's arguing that clear and distinct ideas, like his clear and distinct ideas of God, are innate. That is, they've been present from birth. And of course, this is one of the things that differentiates rationalism from empiricism. Rationalists believe that knowledge, either all knowledge or some knowledge, is present from birth, whereas empiricists, who we'll talk about later on, believe that knowledge comes from the senses. If you remember back to our discussion of Plato and his theory of knowledge, Plato was also a rationalist who believed that all knowledge was in fact innate, but that it was forgotten because of the trauma of birth and death, and it had to be remembered. And that's what Socrates was doing by asking the right questions, trying to get us to birth our ideas that were already there, right? So anyway, Descartes' trying to get beyond this solipsism by arguing that God would not deceive him about the nature of the reality, and because he has clear and distinct ideas of God, he can be sure that such a benevolent, non-deceptive God exists. But there's a bit of circular reasoning going on here. In other words, Descartes is begging the question. He's committing a logical fallacy known as begging the question. And this has actually come to be known as the Cartesian circle. Now, on the one hand, Descartes is saying he knows God exists, he can be certain that God exists, because he has a clear and distinct idea of God. On the other hand, he's saying that he can trust his clear and distinct ideas. His clear and distinct ideas are accurate and trustworthy because God acts as a sort of guarantor for his clear and distinct ideas. So each of these premises support the other, but there's no outside justification for either of them. Hence the circle. So Descartes' kind of been, this is one of the grounds on which he's been criticized for featuring this bit of circular reasoning in his argument. Descartes was also interested in the course of discussing knowledge and certainty and the existence of God, of preserving the role of free will. Now, at the time, you'll remember from some of our previous lectures, a very in vogue idea was that of the clockwork universe. That is a universe that was created by God that worked a little bit like a vast clockwork machine according to laws of nature, right? Now, obviously our bodies are subject to the same laws that planets and stars and all of those things are subject to. So Descartes was thinking, well, how can I preserve freedom of the will in a deterministic, mechanistic clockwork universe like this? Well, to save free will, Descartes proposed that there exist two different kinds of substance. We have on the one hand res extensa, that is extended substance, so basically matter, things that take up space. That's extended substance. Then there's res cogitans, or thinking substance. It's unextended and it thinks. Descartes preserves freedom of the will because res extensa is subject to these mechanical deterministic laws. So extended substance like matter is subject to the laws of nature, whereas res cogitans, or thinking substance, is not. And if you haven't already guessed, res cogitans for Descartes was not just the mind, it was the soul, the immortal soul. So Descartes was able to hold on to the idea of free will in his epistemology, but in solving that problem, he also introduced another problem. And this problem's come to be known as the mind-body problem. Basically, although Descartes had worked out what knowledge he could be certain of and which knowledge he couldn't be certain of, he'd introduced this problem of how a non-physical, non-extended thinking substance, the mind or the soul, interacts with an extended material substance, matter, or the body. So how do these two things interact? That's the mind-body problem. How does the mind control the body if the mind is a non-material substance and the body is a material substance? And how does the body affect the mind? How do our senses work? Vision, audition, touch, these kinds of things. These are all physical processes occurring in the body, and yet I have some kind of mental experience of them. If the mind is immaterial and the body is physical, how do we explain how they interact with one another? Descartes proposed that this interaction took place in the pineal gland, which is a little gland in the center of the brain. But he never really explained how he thought this interaction was supposed to work. He basically posited a place in the mind, or in the brain rather, where it was supposed to happen, but he doesn't explain how it comes to happen. And we still grapple with the mind-body problem in some form or another today. So, for example, those who are interested in studying consciousness often talk about the hard problem of consciousness. How does the brain, which is something physical, give rise to subjective conscious experience? This is essentially the mind-body problem, updated for the 21st century. So our course textbook mentions a few different responses that Descartes' contemporaries offered to the mind-body problem. And in this lecture I want to focus specifically on two of them. And that's Baruch Spinoza's response and Gottfried Leibniz's response. So let's begin with Spinoza's response to Descartes and how he dealt with the mind-body problem. Now, if you remember from some of our recent lectures, Baruch Spinoza was a pantheist. Though a pantheist is someone who believes that God is everything. The famous pantheist dictum is God or nature. Same thing. The universe, God, same thing. So for Spinoza, mind and matter are not actually two different substances. So where Descartes said that mind is res cogitans, unextended thinking substance, and the body is res extensa, that is physical extended matter that takes up space, Spinoza says these are all really the same substance. They're really just it's all basically just God. What Descartes is calling two different substances, Spinoza calls two different attributes of the same substance. So according to Spinoza, God is not only everything, but also a single substance. And not only that, God has infinite attributes. Minds, according to Spinoza, are just finite modifications of God under the attribute of thought. Likewise, bodies are finite modifications of God under the attribute of extension. So for Spinoza, there's no mind-body problem because there's only one substance. So where Descartes is a substance dualist, Baroque Spinoza is a substance monist. That one substance is God, has infinite attributes, and our minds are just one attribute, our bodies are another attribute. Needless to say, a lot of people found this problematic at the time. In fact, some people thought this implied that God had a body, which was considered heresy at the time, and Descartes and Spinoza were both persecuted to some extent for their beliefs. Descartes completed much of his work, as I mentioned earlier, in the Netherlands, where freedom of thought and expression was arguably much better than in France, where he was from. Nonetheless, a lot of his works were banned by the Catholic Church. Spinoza similarly was excommunicated by the Jewish community in Amsterdam, where he lived and worked. And he would finally settle in The Hague, where he would continue working on philosophical problems. So although these ideas are pretty standard in philosophy course today, at the time they were considered extremely radical. So that's Spinoza's response. We aren't dealing with two substances, but one substance, God. He has infinite attributes, and mind and matter are just two of those attributes of the same substance. So there's no mind-body interaction problem. But what about Gottfried Leibniz? Well, Gottfried Leibniz, also a mathematician and philosopher, the co-inventor of calculus, in fact, solved the mind-body problem in a much different way than Spinoza did. Leibniz reduced everything to a single substance, the monad. These monads are unextended, active, teleological bits of substance that make up everything. So they're purposeful. The mind, Leibniz argues, is a monad. The body is a collection of monads. God is the monad of monads. So although Leibniz is a substance monist like Spinoza, his view of what that substance is like is quite a bit different from Spinoza. There's a temptation to think of these monads as akin to the atoms of Democritus, for example. But monads for Leibniz are not little points of matter, the way atoms were for Democritus. Monads are more like zones of force. I suppose you could think of them as similar to the virtual particles we discussed when we talked about relativity and quantum mechanics in some of our earlier lectures. So monads aren't atoms, but they are little tiny, unextended, active, teleological bits of substance that make everything up. They're all intrinsically related to one another, but they don't really interact, according to Leibniz. They don't truly interact with one another. So what we perceive as cause and effect, according to Leibniz, is really just a result of this pre-established harmony, which Leibniz says was set up by God at the time of creation. Now this is a bit of a weird idea to wrap your head around, but think of it like this. Imagine a game of billiards, or pool, like everyone else calls it. So you see the cue ball strike the other balls, and all the balls move in every which way, and our usual way of understanding how that works is via cause and effect, right? The cue strikes the cue ball, which strikes another ball, which causes it to move, so on and so forth. Leibniz says there's no cause and effect actually going on there. There's just a pre-established harmony of monads, such that my pool cue, isn't making the cue ball move. It's just that God had ordained at the time of creation that those monads making up my pool cue would move in such and such a way, and then the cue ball would move in such and such a way after apparently being struck by the pool cue, and that the cue ball would hit the other balls in such and such a way, all pre-established harmony. It's a strange idea to try to wrap your head around, but that's how Leibniz tackled the mind-body problem. There was no problem of interacting, because really there was no real interaction going on. It's all pre-established harmony between the monad that is your mind and the monads that make up your body. All right, so much for how Spinoza and Leibniz dealt with the mind-body problem. Let's turn from rationalism to empiricism now. So what's empiricism all about? Well, following Descartes, or rather contemporarily with Descartes, philosophers, they were known as natural philosophers, nowadays we would call them scientists, began investigating the natural world empirically. Of course, Galileo Galilei was a contemporary of Descartes, and a lot of Galileo's work culminated in the work of Isaac Newton in his Principia Mathematica. And people were absolutely blown away with how Newton was able to explain the workings of the world using observations of the world, together with reason in order to derive laws of nature. And this inspired a movement in philosophy called empiricism, where we should not rely on rational principles, but instead on what our senses tell us about the world. So, unlike Plato and Aristotle or Descartes, who thought it was fine simply to think about things, and that you could come to understand the world just by using reason alone, empiricists thought we had to look at the world itself. And the two empiricists we're going to talk about today are John Locke and George Berkeley. Now, there is a third famous empiricist, of course, and that is David Hume, who is discussed in the course text. But I think because of Hume's place in all of this, and because of his role in awakening Immanuel Kant from his so-called dogmatic slumber, we'll focus on Hume next time and limit ourselves to Locke and Berkeley today. So John Locke was a British philosopher who was interested in clearing away a lot of what he saw as rubbish from rationalist philosophy. So rubbish like innate ideas and so forth. And he did this by pointing out, firstly, that two such ideas, or two such principles that rationalists took to be innate, were not, in fact, innate. These two principles are the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. So what is, that's the principle of identity. And the principle of non-contradiction basically captures the idea that it's impossible for something to be and not to be at the same time. So A is A, and A cannot be not A. That's the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. Rationalists believe these principles were innate. They might have been among, the clear and distinct ideas that Descartes pointed out. But Locke thought that if these ideas were innate, well, everyone should just assent to them automatically, even people who are very young or people who are not very intelligent. So these ideas should have universal assent, and Locke argued that they certainly don't have universal assent. He wrote, and I quote, "All children and idiots have not the least apprehension or thought of them." So that means no universal assent for the principle of identity or the principle of non-contradiction. And if there's no universal assent, well, it follows that they cannot be innate ideas. So the argument goes. So Locke thought there were no innate ideas at all. In fact, he called the mind at birth a tabula rasa. That's Latin for blank tablet or blank slate. All ideas, Locke argued, come from experience, particularly sense experience, what we see, hear, smell, and so on. So Locke thinks all these ideas come from experience, but how do they get into our minds? And what is it that exists in our minds, and what is it that exists in the world? Well, to try to make some of this clear, Locke distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities, and ideas of those kinds of qualities as well, which helped him to provide a bridge between our understanding of the world and the world itself. So, primary and secondary qualities. Well, think back to Descartes' beeswax exercise that he's doing by the fire. The beeswax can change from a solid to a liquid state, but it remains wax. Its essence doesn't change. Whatever makes it wax remains, even if it's solid or if it's liquid. This kind of characteristic, this essential characteristic, is what Locke would call a primary quality. So primary qualities are those qualities that exist in objects themselves. And we can have ideas of primary qualities which exist in our minds. And these ideas are close enough to the primary qualities themselves that they allow us to build an accurate representation of the world. So for Locke, primary qualities included things like solidity or size, extension, that is taking up space, figure, that is shape, mobility, is something in motion or is at rest, and number or quantity. So these are primary qualities, and we can have ideas of these primary qualities in our mind. And according to Locke, these qualities are close enough to these ideas are close enough to the qualities themselves that we can accurately represent the world in most circumstances. But if there are primary qualities, there must also be secondary qualities. And secondary qualities are those qualities that do not exist within the objects themselves, but that only exist within the mind of the perceiver. So secondary qualities are like subjective things rather than objective things. So if primary qualities are objective properties that things in the world have, secondary qualities are qualities that we subjectively perceive objects in the world to have. So secondary qualities might include texture, color, taste, sound, smell, this kind of thing. To take the example, to make a more concrete example, think about a cup of coffee, right? A secondary quality might be the aroma of the coffee, the subjective experience of that aroma. The primary qualities would be the chemical makeup of the coffee. So those are primary and secondary qualities. All right, so much for John Locke and his response to rationalism. But what about George Berkeley? Well, remember, Locke thought that primary qualities existed in the world and secondary qualities existed in the mind. Berkeley reasoned that if secondary qualities existed only in the mind, primary qualities should also exist only in the mind. So all this is to say that where Locke was a realist, that is, what is really real is the external world, Berkeley was an idealist, which is to say what is really real is the mental, or what is in one's mind. And he reasons this because he says that things can only correspond to things like themselves. Ideas, for Berkeley, can't correspond to things out there in the world. In fact, I think for Berkeley, there is no out there in the world. Ideas can only correspond to other ideas. So that's part of his reasoning about what is really real, being the mental. So Berkeley says things like, what is real, or rather, So Berkeley says things like, to be is to be perceived, and not to be perceived is not to be. But then, how do things continue to exist without a perceiver? I mean, if I leave my house and there's no one else at home and I come back, how is it that everything continues to exist while I'm gone? It's a bit like that silly riddle, right? If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, for Berkeley, if there's nobody around, well, there's no tree, no forest, nothing like that. Except there is. And that's because there is a perceiver, according to Berkeley, who continues to perceive everything, even when there aren't people around to perceive it. And that perceiver is the author of nature and nature's laws, i.e., God. So God is like this omnipresent perceiver who's always perceiving everything, everywhere, all of the time. And for Berkeley, that's how it comes to seem like there is an external world or an external reality that exists independently of any one perceiver, because God is there perceiving everything all the time. So it's almost as if for Berkeley, what is real is it's all just what's being perceived in the mind of God. But people have criticized Berkeley for breaking the rules of empiricism here. I mean, Berkeley is not arriving at this conclusion using the principles of empiricism, right? He's not relying on knowledge from his senses to motivate this argument. He's he's making a deductive argument like Descartes did. So he's relying on deductions he's made, reasoning from certain principles. So in that sense, he's a lot more like Descartes than he is like Locke. So what do you think? Is he really an empiricist, or is he merely a rationalist in disguise? All right, so that's all I have for today. You've probably noticed that this lecture has ended up being a little bit shorter than my usual lectures in class. In class, I tend to go on tangents, digressions, that kind of thing, which does take up a little bit of time. And of course, here at home, I also don't have the opportunity to take your questions. So I'm hoping that if any of you have any questions about today's material, you can simply leave them in the comments section. Or, of course, my students will be able to reach me via email, and I will answer your questions that way. Of course, if anyone's watching who's not a student, feel free to leave a comment, leave a question. So, I apologize for the lectures being a little shorter than usual. I imagine the more I do this, the better the lectures will get. So, once again, I just want to say I hope you're all staying well. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to begin bringing the lecture material to you online. Nonetheless, I am committed to fulfilling the learning objective for this course. And if any of you have any questions, please get in touch with me. So that's it for today. Next time, we'll pick it up with David Hume, and we'll talk a little bit about how Hume's work inspired Immanuel Kant's so-called Copernican revolution in metaphysics, which is his attempt to unify rationalism and empiricism. And also, for my students, stay tuned on CU Learn for further updates about your essay and about the final exam and other announcements that I might make about the future of this class. All right, see you next time.